I would like you to cast your mind back to where you grew up. What did the house look like, or the apartment, or wherever it was? What were some of the smells? And in particular, who lived next to you? Who lived on the right side, or the left side, or across the street, or in the apartment across the hall? Think about some of the feelings and memories uh, that go along with when you grew up. My folks still live in the house where I grew up. Only some people move around as they grow up, but I grew up in one place, went to Grain Valley from kindergarten to 12th grade, and it all happened there in Grain Valley. And we lived on Slaughter Road, and it was always weird to explain to people that was related to the people who owned a farm there, the Slaughters, rather than some weird place. Strangely, it had a cemetery on it, Slaughter Cemetery, which was even more weird. But as I was growing up, I walked up and down Slaughter Road, and I knew all the neighbors there. Mary Fairweather lived up on the corner, and she liked to make things with plaster, the plaques and wall hangings, and she was really into crafts. And then down the street a little ways were the Lindsays, and they had a lot of kids. And they had little guinea hens that would run around in the road and sometimes over into our yard. They moved away when I was still pretty young, so I don't have much memory of the Lindsays. But right next to our house were the Applequists, and it was an older couple that had some sons. Charlie was one of their sons, and I would often go up there and talk to them, and they were always nice to me, and sometimes gave me food and drinks, and I guess as you did the neighbor kids. And then there were the Bergers, who had two girls, and there were the Jenkins, and they had several kids, and across from them were the Zellners, and I would often go up to Henry and Myrtle Zellners because they were always nice to me, and Myrtle was always giving me goodies, cookies and cakes, so I often went there. And then up the road a little further was Mrs. Taylor, and she had a goat farm, and it was always fun to see the goats, but particularly when they were having kids. And she would keep them in her house, so you would go in her house, and there were these little goats running around on the furniture and on the cabinets and bouncing around, and it was just wild and wonderful. And then down on the end of the road was Mrs. Dodson, and she had some horses. She was an elderly lady, and I didn't see much of her, but knew that I was always welcome if I stopped in. So I knew all our neighbors by name, by sight, and I had been in every single one of their houses. I knew who my neighbors were. On my street today, I don't know a single one. And there's even a retired Methodist minister who lives 2 houses down. I've only talked to him a couple times, and his wife. I don't know who my neighbors are. I see them come and go. Occasionally I'll have a word with them at the post box or walking down the street, but I don't really know them. I've not been in any of their houses. Don't know most of their names. So who is my neighbor? And that is the question that is asked Jesus. He's together with a group of people, and some of them are religious folks, and one of them asked him, who is my neighbor? Because in that context, who your neighbor was is who you were nice to. If somebody wasn't your neighbor, if they were an enemy, then you didn't have to treat them well. You didn't have to be nice to them. And contrary to what we might think, the religious laws of Judaism were pretty wide in who they included as your neighbor. You were obviously supposed to be nice to all Jews, all people of faith, but you were also supposed to be nice and kind to the foreigners who came among you. We sometimes get a picture of the Jews as staying away from foreigners, which they did to a degree, but they were supposed to treat them well, even foreign slaves. They were not supposed to mistreat them. And so there was a pretty big group of people that they were supposed to treat with respect and kindness. And the discussion that Jesus has is, all right, who is in this circle? Who is included as our neighbor? And to answer that, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. This is one of the first stories I ever remember hearing in Sunday school. Very familiar. I hear it over and over and over again growing up. I imagine you're much the same. We know the story of the Good Samaritan. What I didn't know growing up, well, I just heard that the Samaritans and the Jews didn't really get along, but I didn't know why. So let me tell you why they didn't get along. Even though they were interrelated, even though they had the same ancestors, they worshiped in different places. The Jews worshiped in Jerusalem at the temple. All of them came from across Jerusalem, across Israel, from the lands further afield. They would all travel back to worship in Jerusalem and at the temple. That was their law, that was their custom, that was their tradition. But because the two kingdoms had split back in Israel's history, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern folks worshipped at Mount Gerizim in the north. And to be fair, their claim at Mount Gerizim was even more ancient than Jerusalem. King David was the one who conquered Jerusalem, drove out the Jebusites, and took over Jerusalem, and that became the center of their life. But Mount Gerizim and Shechem go back all the way to Abraham, and to Jacob, and to Joseph. You remember the story of the woman at the well that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. They met at Jacob's well. It's in this place, in Shechem, in Samaria, just down the mountainside, the big hillside. It's only about 500 feet high from Mount Gerizim. So it is an ancient site that the Israelites and the Canaanites and all the people around there have been settling in and worshiping in for thousands of years. And so the Samaritans said, you know, this is really the place that we should worship God. And they even had a temple and a little temple complex with the associated buildings up on top of Mount Gerizim. And so when it was time for the festivals, the same festivals that they were celebrating in Jerusalem, the Samaritans were having those same festivals up on Mount Gerizim. Strange, right? These people who are interrelated, have the same ancestors, celebrating the same holidays in two different places. As can often happen between humans, there was conflict, there was disagreement about their faith, about their traditions, about how they should worship God, and they began to distrust each other. You're not doing it right. You got it all wrong. You're not like us. You should see it our way. And over time, there was more and more conflict to the point when the Jews were fighting against the Greeks. The Jews suspected that the Samaritans were working with the Greeks, and so the Jews went up and wiped out all the buildings on Mount Gerizim. Wiped it all out. Killed anybody who was there. So there was even war between the Samaritans and the Jews. They didn't trust one another. They didn't like one another. They thought the others were wrong. So even though they had a lot in common, they didn't trust each other. And if they could, they would not associate with each other. And to this day, Samaritans cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery because they're different. Right? So there's this animosity between them. which is weird that Jesus would choose a Samaritan as the hero for his story. Who would we choose if we were telling this story? Who are our enemies? Who's the surprise hero? You know, a couple of weeks ago, Jesus told a different story about a tax collector, and the Pharisee and the tax collector turns out to be the hero or the protagonist of the story. Well, this week he's telling a story about Jews, but the Samaritan, the one they don't like, the enemy, is the hero of the story. So the unexpected hero. Who would we choose? Pick your favorite enemy, right? Pick the ones that you don't like, that you don't get along with, that you disagree with, and put that person in the place of the Samaritan. So Jesus tells a familiar story of the person going down from Jerusalem on the curvy road. It drops over 3,000 feet within just a few miles, and so there's lots of curves and cutbacks, and this was a perfect place for an ambush. And that's what happened. Robbers come and they rob the man, they beat him, and they leave him for dead on the side of the road. All familiar to us. And we're familiar too that the priest and the Levite go by, but they don't go by and they don't check on him to see if he's still breathing. They go by on the other side of the road. And for a long time, I thought that this was perhaps they had an excuse. Perhaps they didn't want to become unclean because he was bloody, maybe dead, and so they didn't want the blood, or they didn't want to touch a dead body to become unclean, and so I was giving them a little benefit of a doubt. But about a month or two ago, I was reading this Jewish commentary by Amy Levine. She teaches at Vanderbilt, teaches New Testament, strangely, at Vanderbilt University, and she is a Jew. And she was saying, well, they were going down from Jerusalem, which means they weren't going to the temple, so they didn't have to remain clean. So she contends that they had no excuse for walking by on the other side. They just didn't want to get involved. They had no good excuse. The very people who should have helped didn't. And I think Jesus does this intentionally. Because he could have said, oh, a shopkeeper went by, and like, well, you know, he's got business to attend to. But a priest and a Levite were the very ones that should be helping people in need. And they are the ones that walk by on the other side. And along comes the unexpected one, the unexpected hero, the hero of the story, the storybook hero, the Samaritan, the one we hate, the one we disagree with, the one we mistrust, the one we don't like. Strangely, he is the one that stops, checks on the man, takes him to safety, takes him to sanctuary, and then goes the extra mile to pay for his care. So we can only try to imagine what the Jews hearing this would have thought of Jesus' story. I'm not sure I like this story. It's all wrong. It's all mixed up. The hero's a villain. The hero's somebody I don't like. And of course, Jesus is making a point to try to get them to widen their circle of who's included as their neighbors. And so as he gets to the end and the man is taken care of and his care is paid for, says, who treated this man as a neighbor? The answer is obvious from the story, right? It was, well, that guy that I don't like, but he was a neighbor to the man who was hurt. And so Jesus' instructions are, go and do likewise. Now, does this mean that the Jews had to go take care of Samaritans? Maybe. Does that mean that the Jews had to go and take care of the Romans who were occupying their country? Maybe. They didn't like them. They didn't agree with them. And Jesus is challenging them to expand it to the Samaritans, to the Romans, to the Greeks, to the Egyptians, to everybody. We should treat everybody as a neighbor and extend them the love and care and concern that the Samaritan did. It is really a revolutionary story that Jesus is telling. I've heard it so often that I sometimes just, it's a cute little story that I heard in Sunday school. But no, it is radical. It is revolutionary. There's no safe group that we just stay inside. Okay, we take care of this group, we take care of our family, but we ignore our neighbors across the street. No, we include the neighbors, and we include the next neighborhood, and we include the whole city, and we include the whole state and the nation. And hang on. In a certain sense, everybody in the world is our neighbor. And with our news lately, with people in Houston and people in Puerto Rico and people in Florida and people in California and hurting, and then you don't have to read the news much further that there are people all across the world who are hurting. Who are our neighbors? Who do we extend care to? Who are we willing to pay to be cared for? Because that's what the Samaritan does. He didn't just drop him off at the end. All right, I'm a good guy because I dropped him off at the end. He even goes the second mile and pays for his care. And says if there's any more, he's going to reimburse the innkeeper as he comes back through town. It is a radical story. How far are we willing to go to be the good neighbor? Who do we care for, and to what extent do we care for them? If we want to be the storybook hero that Jesus challenges us to be, everyone is our neighbor. And we extend our care and our generosity to help them to be whole and well cared for. So I would love to have talked to the people there that heard that story that Jesus told. What do you think of that? And just hear their comments. Well, I think he's gone too far. I think it's a pipe dream. I don't think we can really do that. It's just Jesus being idealistic. But that is what Jesus challenges us to be. A neighbor to everyone, to care for everyone. That is how we are the storybook hero. To be the heroes to others. To care for everyone in a generous and compassionate way. There's so much in our world where people don't have empathy. I don't know about you, but I just feel that every day. In traffic, it doesn't seem like people watch out for one another. In stores, they're willing to crowd you out. I see it at the rink. Kids push other kids down just so they can skate the way they want to. In almost every aspect of life. In the news, you see it all the time. A lot of people don't have empathy for others. They don't feel what others are going through. And I hope we can recapture some of that as we look to Jesus as our role model, as the one who guides us in life. The Samaritan was the one who saw the man in pain, who saw the man hurting, and was willing to do something about it. He could sense what it would be like to be beat up and to be left for dead. I wouldn't want to be beat up and left for dead, and so I want to do something for this person who has been hurt. He had compassion and empathy for what he was going through, and he wanted to change that situation. And he did. He went out of his way, gave of his own money to make it happen. So, that is the challenge that Jesus offers us in this simple, simple story. So I hope over the last 3 weeks that you have thought about your stories, growing up, stories of faith, stories of the people that you relate to, your experiences in life. And I hope they've helped you think about who you are, who you want to be, how you relate to God, how together as Crossroads we can make a difference amongst ourselves, in our community, and in our world. Let us pray. Father, we give you thanks for those who bring love into difficult situations. We thank you for those who have empathy, who see ways to care for others. We thank you for those in our own lives who have cared for us, who've helped us through difficult circumstances, who've been there when we needed a hand to hold or a shoulder to cry on. We thank you for those who have encouraged us, who have supported us. We thank you for those who have picked us up when we have been down. Father, give us your love so that we might see others who are in need and find ways to help them, to lift them up, and to be their hero in their moment of need. This we ask in the name of Christ. Amen.